Thank you for joining us. This is Doug Cook, your host for tonight. I'm the Education Events Coordinator for NOFA Mass. And before we get started, I would like to thank all of the NOFA Mass board and staff who've contributed to the production of this webinar, the fifth in a series of 5 events focusing on improving your pastures and products with intensive grazing practices. We also want to thank our grant funders, the Massachusetts Dairy Farmers, and you can learn more about the Massachusetts Dairy Farmers at massdairy.com. As well, the Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation Green Pastures Fund, which has the goal to preserve and encourage small community-based agricultural ventures in the Berkshires. And our sponsors, the Organic Valley. And you can learn more about the Organic Valley Co-op at organicvalley.coop. And most importantly, we want to thank you who are here viewing and listening, especially to our members who make our education and advocacy work possible. If you find this event useful and inspiring, please become a NOFA Mass member or make a donation to help support our important work. So now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Topher Sabot, who grew up in the Berkshires and after several years out west, returned to help manage Cricket Creek Farm and took over daily operations in 2009. Topher oversees all aspects of the business, but focuses his attention mostly on the dairy herd and health and breeding and forage and things like that.
My name is Topher Sabot, and I own and run Cricket Creek Farm in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and we're a small grass-based dairy farm where we practice intensive rotational grazing, produce farmstead artisanal cheese, raw milk, grass-fed beef, whey-fed pork, and have a small on-site farm store with a bunch of other local and regional products. We milk up to 40 cows at most. The herd is a combination of pure Jerseys, pure brown Swiss, and then quite a few crosses. We've mixed in milking Devon, some New Zealand Friesian, and are going to be working with some Normandy as well. So we have very much a mixed herd, and we have about, give or take, a few 80 cows on the farm all told between our dairy herd, dry cows, heifers, and then we do have some beef cows as well. Our primary product is the cheese. About 90% of our milk goes to the cheese production, so that's really the economic driver of the farm. The remainder of the milk is sold bottled and sold as raw milk from the farm store. So we don't ship any bulk milk. So we're fortunately insulated from the fluctuations of conventional or even organic milk prices. And so we have the ability to kind of control the sale of our products. Obviously that creates its sort of own set of challenges for sure. We make roughly 30,000 pounds of cheese a year, which we sell through the farm store. We go to a lot of farmers markets, up to 5 a week in the summer, and then approximately 60% of our sales is through wholesale, primarily in the greater New England Northeast region. And the aged cheeses we make are raw milk cheeses. The fresh cheeses are pasteurized milk cheeses, and we really focus very strongly on milk quality and above quantity. And our products are very characteristic of our grasses and our cows, and they change dramatically seasonally. And one of sort of the big projects that we've had here is making consistent cheese on changing feed. And as we've expanded our markets and done more wholesale, customers expect a consistent product. And that can sometimes be challenging because when the cows go from eating stored feed, we make hay and baleage here, to grass, that has a huge impact on the milk chemistry and therefore the cheese. But then even over the course of the grazing season and the winter season, as the cows move through their lactation, as the grasses change with the weather, that also has a pretty big impact on the end product. And so there's a lot of communication between the cheesemakers and the farmers, and sort of we do sometimes make changes to the farming practices specifically to try to address some of the challenges with the cheese. And so it's sort of very much a symbiotic relationship there. So the milk, you know, our aged cheeses are raw milk cheeses, and we sell raw milk. And so, you know, the food safety and animal health side of things, it's most critical in the milking parlor. That is the interface between, you know, clean milk inside the cow, an environment that is inherently somewhat dirty, and then, you know, our bulk tank, which also is completely clean. And so probably the most critical step for the cheese making, for the milk, and for sort of udder health is that process of actually prepping the cows and milking them in an extremely sanitary fashion. So we put a huge amount of focus on that and work really, really hard to ensure that our milk is, you know, of the highest quality. And sort of outside of like the food safety and the other health issues, it's also really important for cheese quality, and having milk that is, you know, free of any sort of negative foreign bacteria is pretty critical, especially for the aged cheeses, where the introduction at any point in the process of undesirable bacteria can create, you know, basically bad cheese. It can form gas in the cheese. It can cause off flavors. So even things that are not at all detrimental to human health can cause the cheese to be bad. So it's a very, very important thing. And we milk the cows. The milk passes through a filter. It's like a sock filter. It filters out any large particulate matter, but that's it. It goes into the bulk tank. After going through a plate cooler, it's cooled down very quickly to below 40 degrees, and then that's it. We fill the bottled milk right out of the bulk tank, and then we have a system where we can set up pipes through a hole in the wall right into our cheese vat and gravity feed into the cheese vat. You know, for the pasteurized cheeses, the milk's generally pasteurized, cooled down, start the cheese making process. For the raw milk cheeses, you know, the milk's in the vat. It's heated up to, you know, roughly 100 degrees to start the cheese making process, and then the cheese is made. So, you know, the physical distance from the cow to the cheese vat is short, and also sort of the number of steps in many ways. It's not overly complicated, but it's super, super important. You know, the aging of the cheese is a critical step, especially for the aged cheeses. And so we have, at this point, 3 different, you know, climate controlled rooms that we use for the different cheeses. And the cheeses have pretty specific requirements, and, you know, varying dramatically from those requirements will cause undesirable things to happen. So, you know, generally the rooms are held at approximately 50 degrees at very high humidity, like 98% humidity. So, you know, and that's been something that's been a challenge here, is that the aging space is a scarce resource. And that's one of the reasons we started, you know, 6, 7 years ago, developing some more fresh cheeses, because we're able to bring those to market more quickly, because as we increased our sort of size of our dairy herd, making more cheese, which we needed to do for the business, we started running out of aging space, and that still remains sort of a challenge. And the fresh cheeses, we have one cheese that's basically ready to sell in a couple days, and then others that are, a week to 3 weeks, and so we can move that out faster and make less of the aged cheeses, which we need to keep around for a long time and have the facilities to do it. Yesterday morning, they came out and they had the top half of this paddock with a temporary break. When the afternoon milker came out, he sent the cows in. He took up that line, moved it over to the next paddock. So when the cows came out after milking last night, they then had all this paddock. So they did have the ability to back graze the top, but they go right to the bottom. They graze the bottom half. This morning when I came out, I jumped the water tub down, opened the gate to the next paddock, closed this one. They go in, they have the top half. The one piece that's missing that we haven't sort of instituted yet, in part because at this time of year, for basically 3 to 6 weeks, we sort of almost have too much grass, is this solar powered automatic gate that we use and that we will start using pretty soon. And that basically, the way we utilize that is instead of, for the daytime part, so instead of having initially half of this paddock, they would have a quarter. And then that's just another temporary transect. At one end of it, there's basically a slinky gate that's hooked into a little device that's solar powered and programmable. And then I think we have it last year, I think we had it set at noon. This little latch pops open, the gate shoots back. Probably took 3 days of pushing the cows through before they learned, and then they go through and they have that second quarter for the day. So they're not getting more area, but by giving them a smaller area, they have to eat more evenly. What happens, the bigger area you give a cow, they're just going to walk over the whole thing looking for the choicest stuff. And that might not even be what's like best for them to eat. It's going to be what they want to eat the most. So it might be the sweetest or the shortest and most tender. But we want them to eat more uniformly. We want them to eat some things that are maybe have grown a little more and are a little more tougher, higher in lignin. And so by giving them a smaller area, they're going to trample less because they're going to have less they can walk around on, and they're going to have to eat it more evenly. Another part of it is the more often sort of you give new grass, it sort of, I guess the word is, it almost like motivates the cow to eat more, because you're all of a sudden are like, here you go, here's like another bowl of ice cream. And they're like, ooh, like I'm not that hungry, but it's delicious, so I'm going to eat it. And every time a cow gets up, they tend to like poop more. And so like the manure is going to be distributed more evenly and more frequently. And so like, I've heard that like, and this is obviously not sort of desirable for many other respects, but in some of these huge like beef ranches in Brazil, they'll have like two guys on four-wheelers with a line driving very slowly, and so it's sort of like the cows never have more to eat than they can have their heads on at a time. And while that style of farming is not good in many ways, that sort of idea of only giving them as little as possible and moving them as often as possible is sort of something that's desirable. And like, honestly, we could move them 6 times a day and that would probably be better, but there's the labor issue. And we've always wanted to move the cows more often, but because of our staffing levels, it didn't seem reasonable to be able to do that. And so with this sort of like automatic gate thing, it just means there's one setup. Usually it would be the afternoon milker the night before would set it up. It's sort of built into those tasks when you're doing it anyway. And so it only adds 5, maybe 10 minutes at most. So it's really efficient. And then no one else has to come back out here in the middle of the day for a separate move. And we've thought about, even maybe adding another one, experimenting on whether it would work at night or not. Or maybe adding some for the heifer groups, which we tend to move just once every 24 hours right now. And by adding that in, we could easily bring that up to twice without, again, adding, um, you know, a lot of labor. So it's a pretty cool thing, and we're pretty excited, about it, and we feel it's worked well, and really ties into the idea of like efficiency and utilizing the resources efficiently as possible. Yeah, it depends on the field, and so like these ones out here, we generally don't. As we walked out, you can see we have like metal T posts, and like even though most of it's poly wire, we don't manipulate them a lot. There would definitely be some advantages later in the grazing season of like making the paddocks bigger, because you can't really give them like 3/4 of a paddock because then they only have 1/4 of a paddock left. And so, how do you graze that? And at times we have done that, but that does require, some weird things like pulling back, like the transects running this direction in places. So you kind of give them 1/4 of a paddock and then like, a third of another one, access to the bottom. So we will do some of that at times, but we try not to. The other thing that we're dealing with is that if we make our paddocks bigger to give them more when it's hotter, we are then just cutting our recovery time, because you know we'll then move through what we have faster. Um, and that is an issue too. So what we often end up having to do to maintain the recovery times we need is that as we get later into the grazing season, we do end up supplementing with hay in the barn more, as much as like we'll get up to as much as like a bale a day, to supplement. And so there's like pros and cons to that. And the big thing we've done for the recovery is we've extended our cow water and road infrastructure to be able to send them out on hay fields later. So that also allows us to um, expand our grazing, keep our recovery periods where we need them to be. And those ones, those are set up new every single season. And so we have, it's easier there to be like, well, we're going to need less recovery, but the grass isn't as high. We'll just set those paddocks bigger. We'll still use breaks in them, but we can give them, control the amount, a little more easily. And so there's, pros and cons again. Like, there's like a lot more labor to like breaking down this entire system of gates and transects and everything to adjust based on the weather. If we did that, we could probably, supplement a little bit less at various times of year. But, there's always a cost. Like if we pull in more hayfield, then have less winter feed and then we're buying in more. And so there's sort of a, you know, ideally we would just honestly have like more land. That would help a lot of things, but I think that's often true. So, yeah.
Could you speak a little bit about some more specifics? How many acres are you grazing on annually, and break it down? You mentioned that you did have some acreage for hay and whatnot. What's that? Oh, you're on mute. Hold on. Wait a minute. Okay, go ahead. You're unmuted.
So yeah, it's hard to give you an exact number, mainly because as I sort of referenced in the video, we do cut some things like on first cut and then start grazing it, or we might cut it for twice and then start grazing it. So all told, we farm about 200 acres. There's a lot of the farm that's not in, that's woods or swamp or stuff like that, but roughly between grazing and hay, it's about 200 acres. And over the last 5 years, everything has been grazed at some point. Not everything is paid. Some of the pasture is not suitable, but even our sort of most remote fields, at some point we have grazed it. So, we start the season with the dairy cows with probably, rotating through, 25, 28 acres, in the spring when the grass is growing fast. And, by this time, after 2 times through, we start bringing in hay fields for the dairy cows that then become grazing, so we can start extending that recovery period. And, we'll add, another certainly 20 odd acres at least to the dairy grazing through that. And then with the heifers and the beef group and things like that, it's also similar in that, we'll cut things and that will then graze with those groups. And those are fields that it's not efficient or possible to walk the cows, the dairy herd to twice a day. They're either not contiguous or just too far.
And what's your solution for bringing water and other, supplies that they need out there?
Yeah, the water has been a key thing, and it's definitely, one of maybe the major limitations in terms of grazing, because that is, as important as the grass and the pasture. So we have a combination of systems, and so the dairy cows run on a water line that starts from the barn, basically, and until recently, that was all just above ground, black PVC pipe with portable tubs. Recently, we got a grant from the state of Massachusetts that has allowed us to put in some buried water line. Not a ton of it, but enough that it'll allow us to extend the grazing season once it starts to freeze at night. And it also means that the water they're getting from that line is cold in the hot time of the summer, which is really nice as well. So that's been good. Other groups that are further afield, we often end up watering in natural water sources like streams and springs. We work hard to minimize the negative impact that cows can have on those waterways. So it's definitely a combination, and we've built out the infrastructure over the years, adding more line. And, I was at a grazing workshop by Troy Bishop a number of years ago, and he was sort of touting that as a really important thing to do, and that the cost of adding above ground water line is very low overall. And that's definitely something that I've learned, that I've never been sad to add more water line, especially if it means the cows have to walk less to get water, and to make our lives easier in the long run. So that can be done pretty well. I do see a question from Mary Franklin there. So she was asking what's our recovery length right now. So we've just sort of finished our second pass, and usually the recovery between the first and the second pass is not a lot more than 21, 22 days. And, that's coming off of still like the spring flush. And we've now, though, are not going back and starting a third pass at the beginning. We are now grazing one of the hay fields, and that's going to push the recovery time up. Every season is different. Certainly right here, we have gotten very, very little rain, and the grass is pretty stalled out. And one of the advantages of the hay field that we're grazing now is what we usually do is we sort of just keep adding paddocks as we need them. And we'll reach a point where we can kind of make a call that the other grass is getting close, and then we cut the rest of it for second cut. I think there's a decent chance this year that, unless things change in a hurry, we'll graze most of it because of the hot, dry weather. The other pastures are just not coming back. And so that gives us nice flexibility where, if we need to push things out to 45 days at this point recovery, we can do that. And there's a cost to that. The cost will be in less winter feed, which means we'll have to buy in some more feed, but it's certainly better than overgrazing our pastures or putting the cows in the barn and feeding them in the barn, which would also sort of defeat the whole purpose. So having that flexibility is really nice and gives us a tool to sort of manage weather, which, around here, we obviously have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. And so being able to be really flexible that way has been key.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah. And as you said, you sort of shift. Sometimes you can add paddocks. You must have found some simple solutions for moving your fence around. What are those?
Um, People is really helpful. um, it's obviously fairly labor intensive. And the other thing is, having a lot of fencing supplies, and, it's a balance between just buying a lot of stuff and, having to move it around. And so, we use very low input fencing for the most part. So on these hay fields, we're just using pretty much polywire, not even sort of the highest quality, and then super lightweight posts. The 3/8 inch posts, fiberglass posts, with clip insulators that are the smallest you can get. And that's easy to move around, easy to pick up, and really inexpensive. And we actually use a lot of that even in our sort of like quote permanent fencing areas. We do run some metal on perimeters and along cow lanes where we don't move it, but we don't use any high tensile or anything like that. And that's another thing that I think is really good for people to think critically about, is sort of not just what the fencing books say or experts say in terms of how to build fence, but like what works on your farm. And we're in an area where if cows get out, it's not the end of the world. We're on a very quiet road. Our neighbors range from supportive to neutral, but generally, it's okay. And so we don't need to have 3 strands of high tensile around the whole farm, which would be very costly to put in and costly to maintain. We can run lighter duty fencing. We try to keep our cows really trained well to it. We try to keep it as hot as possible, but it also is very low cost, very low maintenance, and very flexible. So that works here. If we were a mile down the road on Route 7, which is very, very busy, we couldn't do that because it's just not really an option to have cows getting out on a main road like that, and it would be very dangerous. So, we've customized our fencing for our needs to sort of balance efficiency and cost with, sort of long-term usability.
I was thinking of sort of switching gears a little bit to talk some more about your dairy facilities. But maybe you want to start off and tell us what sort of systems do you use for milking?
Yeah, so we have, what's called like a New Zealand swing parlor. And so it's you saw some shots of the parlor in the video. It was built new in 2002. I wasn't involved with the design and construction. It's definitely a very big parlor for the number of cows we're milking. It's a parlor you could comfortably milk, 100 cows in. There's 11 units. So if you brought in cows on both sides, that would be 22 cows at a time. It's a big pit. There's easily room for 2 people. You can even run 3 people in there. Because of the number of cows we milk, we usually only have one person milking, and we use only one side. You really don't need more than 11 cows to deal with one person. But when things are moving well with an experienced milker, it's, maybe an hour in the pit actually milking. So it's pretty luxurious for like a 35 cow dairy to have a parlor that size. The maintenance costs are a little higher because it's big, but overall, feel that it's worth it. And we run a pretty lean staff, and so having milking be efficient is really important. And so that works really, really well for us overall.
Tell us a little bit about the cheese room. How is it set up? You mentioned a little in the video, you have a gravity fed system into the vat. So why don't you start from there?
Yeah, basically the cheese room and the milk room are right next to each other with a wall in between, obviously. But the cheese room is actually, the floor is maybe 2.5 to 3 feet lower. And I actually don't know if that was by design. The cheese room was built actually where the old milking parlor was. So I think it was just actually good luck that we can gravity feed from our bulk tank. We just run a stainless steel pipe through a hole in the wall right into the vat, which works really, really well. It doesn't require any equipment. It doesn't require a pump. You just like open the valve and it flows right over. So super low tech, super simple. We do have the ability to milk directly into the vat if we want. Like our pipeline system runs through the wall and does a loop and goes through the part of the creamery. So you can set up a downspout and drop milk directly in. And that was sort of conceived of. There is sort of this ideal of making cheese with only the freshest milk, so directly from one fresh milking. But that's obviously extremely inefficient and not really workable unless you had another outlet for your milk, and we're only making cheese occasionally. So we don't actually do that at this point, but that was sort of like part of the conception. And so we have a pretty big make room, and with at this point 3 different aging rooms, 2 that are connected off of the cheese facility. Then we have an auxiliary one in another building, and are actually in the process of sort of constructing a new one out of an old reefer box as well, to increase our aging and storage capacity, because that's been a major limiting factor here for years. So it's all kind of very close together, which is efficient and good, easy to move the milk around. You know, certainly by having it all in one facility right there, it, you know, does create some sanitation challenges when you're sort of mixing farmers and cheesemakers in a close space. But we sort of can deal with that. And there's, you know, there's a great picture of our creamery. You can see the vat in the corner there, and the wall that we're looking at, you can't actually see the pipe where it comes through. It's sort of behind the vat, but it comes right through that wall into the vat right there. So yeah, that gives, I think, a good, you can see the long table on the left with all the molds on it. That is our make table. And yeah, it's that's our sort of main equipment. We just have the one vat and no other processing equipment. And we have different setups for our aging spaces. You know, they were originally built with sort of full external compressor units. And then when one of the rooms failed, instead of the costly replacement of both the evaporator and the compressors, you know, for a total cost of around $10,000, we actually installed an air conditioner and a cool bot to do that. And we recently, with the help of a significant grant, converted that room back to a much more high-tech aging environment. And we still run a cool bot and AC in our auxiliary room, but for the types of cheeses we were making in that room, we just needed better control of the the conditions in the room. And I think that's sort of a good example of, like, sometimes you do have to go with the more expensive solution. And, you know, we tried the low cost, low tech way. And again, it didn't really work for that room, but it does work for a different room with a different type of cheese. So there was some trial and error there.
I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about, you've said you had a mixed herd. Was that a choice for milk quality, or what were your motivations for having such a mixed herd?
Yeah, the original herd, which I was sort of not involved with, was Jerseys, you know, I think for many of the classic reasons of high components in terms of butter, fat, and protein, you know, small animals to work with. And then there was someone here who was running the farm operations for some time, who was a brown Swiss guy. So he brought in a bunch of brown Swiss genetics. And so when I took over, I had a mixed herd of basically Jerseys and brown Swiss. And, you know, some of those genetics definitely still remain in terms of having both brown Swiss and Jersey cows. But we've done a lot of crossing. We experimented going down the road of line breeding, and we bought in a bull from another farm that's had a lot of success with that. He was a young bull, so there was definitely no guarantees, and we bred a lot with him until he sort of had some personality issues and had to leave. And the idea was to continue to breed with his semen, which we had drawn and frozen. But unfortunately, we had some bad luck, and sort of the genetic dice did not roll in our favor, and his daughters did not pan out well at all. And so that mixed in a lot of sort of milk and Devon genetics. And since then, we've done a little bit more moving back towards some of the pure Swiss and pure Jerseys, but we're working with a lot of Jersey Devon crosses and Swiss Devon crosses. We've started mixing in some New Zealand Friesian because we've had some very good cows come out of a New Zealand Friesian Swiss cross. And so we've moved away from the line breeding approach and are doing more sort of looking to breed specific cows in specific ways to kind of create the animal we want, but are not going down the road of sort of putting all our eggs in one basket again, because if that works, it can be very, very successful. But because it didn't work for us, it ended up setting us back genetically for some years, and that ended up being pretty costly. And so at this point, we're being a little bit more conservative and trying to, kind of hedge our bets a little bit with the genetics. And we like variety. We're definitely not like breedists, which some people are, where they're like, I milk registered Holsteins only or registered Jerseys only. So, we like having a variety and having cows that look different, and we have a lot of different personalities. And maybe in some ways that's not always the most efficient, but sometimes it's not all about efficiency, and it's also about doing what you like to do. And it's been really a nice process and challenge to sort of figure out where we want to go genetically and sort of the ways we feel is the best way to get there. And so we do a combination of artificial insemination and then bull breeding with bulls that we raise here. So yeah, that's a sort of a big focus right now for sure.
Mm-hmm. And have you found that some of your variety breeds have been doing better on like an all grass or grass-based system?
Yeah, it's hard to say. Like, definitely some individual cows do better than others, and so that's one of the things we're trying to identify. Like, our genetic goal is sort of to bring our sort of, if you rank our herd on whatever metric that we might use, taking the bottom third or even the bottom half and making those as good as sort of our top half. So we feel like our best cows do pretty darn well, and based on our low input system, primarily grass, we can't really ask more out of them, like maybe some marginal improvements. And so then we're like really identifying specific cows, really trying to keep daughters out of those best cows and bring sort of the whole herd average up in that way. And so I can't really say that, if we rank our cows in a lot of different ways, but, however we do it, we have, Jerseys at the top, we have some Swiss at the top. We ended up, for a variety of reasons, with a couple random Holsteins, and one of those Holsteins actually does really well on our grass-based system, and the other not so great, and she probably won't stay around as long. Some of the crosses, as I said, we've got a Swiss New Zealand Friesian cross who's one of our best cows. So the short answer is no, that I can't say one breed does better. And we're definitely selecting for the cows that now over the past decade have shown that they do well and then working with those. And I see that a couple questions popped up. One of how many heifers do we keep per year, and then what the herd average is. And so with the heifers, we're looking at around a dozen. Long term, we would like to keep fewer turn the herd over more slowly, but we have been pretty aggressive about turning the herd over, in part because of sort of our breeding deviation that we went down, and trying to, like from a production standpoint, not necessarily milk volume, but in terms of components or, efficiency, we had some pretty bad cows. And so we're moving aggressively to replace those with better cows. So we're keeping more heifers than we ideally would. Like, I would love to get to a point when maybe we're only raising 5 replacement heifers a year. And, I get nervous, about something happening to a cow unexpectedly. And that always leads to us keeping in probably a couple more than we ideally need to. We have a very good grass-fed beef market that we channel our cull cows into. So if we do keep an extra heifer and we end up not needing her, we can, she can be utilized well that way. So that gives us a little more flexibility on that front. And in terms of our herd average, in terms of pounds of milk, we're looking at, 32, at most 35 pounds per cow per day on average over the course of the year. We definitely run a semi-seasonal herd with calving clustered in the late winter, spring, and early summer. So we have a pretty high fluctuation. On the fresh grass, we're running 45 pounds a cow in the spring, and in winter, as the herd is slowing way down on the stored feed, we might be at 26 pounds per cow. In fat, we sort of average around 4.5% annually. Again, we have pretty big seasonal fluctuations that, runs over 5 in the winter when they're later lactation on the stored feed, and, comes down to the lower 4s usually on the spring flush, protein sort of 3.5, 3.7 in that area. And so, the milk volume is not really something that we, and that was something it's easy to get caught up in terms of how many pounds of milk a cow is making. But since we are more interested in their sort of components, we've sort of recalibrated most of our sort of rankings to focus on components and fat and protein. And it's pretty cool to see like a cow that you're like, oh, she's not making that much milk, and then when you look at her pounds of fat, she's much better than the cow making 20% more milk. And that's not an overly complex concept, but it's pretty easy to get too caught up in the volume of the milk itself as opposed to the volume of the components. And thinking about how to evaluate your cows, certainly statistically is I found really important, but also, not ignoring the sort of holistic perspective. And one of the things that we've come across as we've been researching bulls and breeding, and we've bought some semen that's come out of New Zealand, where they really focus on grazing a lot, and they have rankings in their sort of conventional bull catalogs, which is, I think it might be called like likability, or there's a metric which is basically just how much the farmer likes that working with that animal. And I think it's really interesting that is a component of these conventional bull rankings, and shows sort of the importance of the human intuition and just experience with the animal, and that sometimes you need to balance the data with that as well, because it can be pretty important, and there's so many variables to look at.
Yeah. I was wondering if seasonal, variety in their feed and fluctuations in feed quality and then milk quality, does that also affect the cheese that you're making? Are you making certain cheeses at certain times of year, or?
Yeah, and I guess first of all, I would say like I wouldn't use the word quality. We like try to maintain like even quality of milk throughout the year, but certainly the milk chemistry changes, and we sort of there's a natural seasonal change in the milk because we're a grazing farm, and so that's one of the challenges you take on when you're grazing and making cheese is that the feed is constantly changing. And every day they're on a different paddock, and certainly the difference between grass on May 15th and grass on July 15th is very different. And so you have those changes, plus since we're fairly seasonal, you have the changes that happen as the herd shifts along the lactation curve. So we take the feed seasonality and then compound that with the stage of lactation seasonality, and that creates a lot of challenges in the creamery. And it's pretty cool to try to figure it out, but it's also been very frustrating at times. And certain cheeses are much more finicky, and it's been a multi-year research project to try to dial things in to make cheese that's consistent to wholesale, but it's also that's what you get with sort of a handmade product. You get something really unique, and we're still every season. It's like we've learned more, but we also have a lot more to learn, and it makes for a lot of really interesting dialogue between cheesemaker and farmer, because it really is so inextricably connected. So yeah, that's, challenging, but also pretty neat. And I see that, Amanda had a question on warm season annuals. And overall, we don't do very much cropping. Certainly we don't grow any corn. We don't generally plow up and plant large areas of warm season annuals for grazing. Some of that has to do with just our limited land base. I think that would be an interesting thing to work with, and would also really help buffer these really hot, dry times, is to plant some things that do better in it. But we also try to avoid excess tillage, and work really hard to build the organic matter in our soil and to build really good soil health. And so try not to do too much heavy tillage. We have done periodic resets of large hay fields. Those have happened sort of like on a decade sort of basis. And we are currently sort of slowly moving through a bunch of our dairy grazing, doing a series of annuals over the course of the summer on 1 or 2 paddocks. So we're talking 1.5 to 3 acres at a time. We can still graze those annuals. It doesn't disrupt our entire grazing system. And we've done that primarily to try to deal with invasives that we're having problems with. So less specifically to take advantage of warm season annuals as a forage resource, and more to try to get rid of invasive species. But I think with a bigger land base, it might put us in a position to utilize warm season annuals really well, especially as a buffer to sort of changes in climate patterns. So I hope that answers that question. And Mary Franklin asked about spreading manure and compost on our pastures. We definitely do. I would say most of it ends up going on the areas that are primarily hay fields. We still graze those for sure. Our primary dairy pastures, because we never take anything off, we never collect forage off of them in the form of haying, we can maintain them pretty well. We're pretty lucky to have decently natural high pHs of our soil. There's a lot of limestone around here, so we do a little bit of liming, but not a lot. We do a fair amount of bale grazing in the winter on some of the dairy paddocks, so that adds a lot of organic matter and manure in that way. But we concentrate sort of our manure on the hay fields where we are taking a lot of organic matter off every year in the form of hay. And that's definitely, I would say, our biggest challenge is fertility management, because we definitely have fields that it's impractical to get to with like a manure spreader, even with like a fertilizer truck, and trying to manage that. And we've used bale grazing with heifer groups as a way to add fertility to those areas as much as possible. That's become much more limited as our winters have gotten warmer. It rains a lot more, and cold rain we found has been really rough on our heifers. So we now try to keep our heifer groups closer to the farm so we can bring them in for that type of weather. And so that's sort of been like another challenge of sort of shifting climate. And in terms of compost, we do some composting. I wish we had sort of the space and equipment and time to better compost our manure, because we could utilize it better and more efficiently. But we sort of do the best we can. I certainly have seen farms that have much better systems for that work better for sure.
And as you are talking about soil health, are you doing soil tests regularly?
Yeah, we do. We don't get everything every year, but we definitely check in on that. Looking at all the basics. We don't do a lot of amending. We're not a certified organic farm. I have some reservations about spreading a lot of just sort of conventional fertilizer. The cost of organic fertilizer is very expensive. So we have really worked hard to, utilize the manure we have, and then, work with the grazing. And like, we have a field that we've been haying for some years that's, definitely looking a little spent, could definitely use some help. We'll definitely soil sample it, but we'll also probably just say, okay, we're not going to cut hay on it, or maybe we'll only take a first cut and we're just going to graze it for a few years. We'll do our best to get some cows on there in the winter. And in the past, that's worked really well to bring that back. And when you sort of weigh the cost of fertilizer, sometimes having to buy in a little bit more feed while you graze something and bring it back that way actually costs less money and is sort of less resource intensive. But it is hard. Like, the fertility thing is, at the end of the day, they're fields that you're taking more off of than you're putting on if you're cutting the hay. And that's one of the great things about the grazing, obviously, is that it's not a completely closed system, but it's a lot closer to a closed system.
Are you taking forage samples and analyzing forage samples?
Yep, we do a fair bit of that with our, winter feed, and we've done less recently. We end up with like a lot of relatively small kind of cuts of bales, 30 bales here, 20 bales there, and it quickly is not cost effective to sample every grouping. But we've done enough, and I try to keep very good records on, all the details of cutting each field, each cut, the conditions, how we managed it and handled it. And then when we do sample, we can then, draw conclusions about, how long between cutting and baling, what the weather was like and how quickly it was wrapped, what time of day we cut it, and use that to then sort of be able to predict forages as well, so we can sample less every year to save money on that, but still have a pretty good idea of what we're feeding to the cows.
Yeah.
And that definitely, I think, one of the things that over the years, has really served us well is like working on good systems for record keeping that aren't overly complicated and take too much time, but provides, a lot of information. And, you know, 8 years ago, I felt like I could remember everything. And now, I can't even remember what we did on first cut this year. So I had better be able to like refer to my spreadsheet, and let alone what we did last year or the year before. And so trying to keep good records, and that's critical for grazing. We got started using, grazing charts, probably 6 or 7 years ago, and that's been invaluable for managing the grazing and, improving the efficiency and our pasture quality. And so I think if people, do nothing else, sort of like keeping a grazing chart, is sort of the best possible thing.
Does that correspond to any map or grazing plan?
Yeah, like, some people do a lot of planning in the spring for their grazing, often using a grazing chart. So, that's a standard chart where, you often have your fields or pastures, on sort of the left column, and then just every day going across the right, and you can like fill in the blocks as you move. And we've gotten pretty elaborate with all sorts of fun colors for the different groups of animals, and we track how many animals in each group, and if we clip, and we also track rainfall. And so we don't try to plan our grazing season. There's just too many variables. We have too many groups of animals, too many things change, staff changes, the weather, obviously. And so if we planned out 5 months of grazing, often after 2 weeks, it might be completely scrapped. So we usually will plan like, at times like several weeks in advance, when we're figuring out where groups will move next. And that's going to be based on what those fields look like, what the pastures look like, how things are recovering, what the animal needs are. Sometimes there'll be things like, somebody's going to be on vacation, so we can't really move this group, a mile down the road on the road because we don't have enough, people to do that. Oh, we're hosting a wedding on the farm and they want to have the dairy cows right there, so we need to plan our grazing so they're there. So like we'll do that, planning a couple weeks, a month in advance. And we certainly know the fields well, but another thing I did that I found really helpful was I got a large format satellite image of the farm printed up, and laminated. So we have a visual map of the farm that we can, write on with dry erase markers. And that's super helpful, especially with like apprentices and stuff in terms of explaining fencing projects or where we're going to move animals and things like that. And you can certainly just do that online with like Google Maps, but being able to write on it, and the big format is pretty nice and handy. And, that was a pretty easy thing to have done. So that was something I'd recommend as well.
And now we may have glossed over, how many staff do you have on your farm?
It depends when you ask me, and how many we have is often not how many we want. It does fluctuate. We have an apprenticeship program. On the farm right now, it's myself and Emily, who's like the, I guess like the assistant farm manager, and she's been here 5 years. And then we have one apprentice, and that's it. For what we're trying to do and sort of the responsibilities that I have with sort of the business as a whole, that is sort of drastically understaffed. At times we'll have an hourly milker, who just comes in and milks. We would like to have a second apprentice right now, certainly. So that's sort of the farm staff. The creamery is a whole other beast and definitely adds a lot. We have a head cheese maker and one apprentice. Right now we happen to be transitioning to a new cheese maker, so we have an overlap. So we sort of have two head cheese makers and one apprentice right now, which is also drastically understaffed. We've at times had 3 apprentices in there we have a part-time hourly person who helps out. And then we have like an operations manager who handles like sales, hiring, marketing, coordinating our farmers markets, like ordering stuff, wholesale, sort of all those things. So, I don't know what that added up to, maybe 7, 8 people, but ideally we'd be running at more like a dozen or so. But it's been very challenging. And when things are well staffed, things tend to run relatively smoothly for a dairy farm. And when we're understaffed, we're sort of always behind. And that's been something that I've had to kind of become comfortable with. Grazing cows is sort of like, you can't always be perfect. And the more you learn, sort of the more you realize you could be doing. And that can be really exciting and empowering. And it can also be overwhelming because there's always something more you could do. There's always another project that would allow you to graze more efficiently, or to build your pastures better, or to make it easier on the cows. And so needing to be patient and also recognize, like, we don't have as much staff, so we can't manage this piece as intensively. We're going to have to give the cows a somewhat bigger area, move them less often, but that's what we have to do right now. And so that sort of flexibility and sort of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good has been really important.
And do you have any references or resources that you recommend to people when they're starting to learn more about this type of grazing and dairy production?
I think the single best thing, which I found really hard to do, which is one of the frustrating things, is like visiting as many other farms as will have you. Like, it's so helpful. And, any problem you come up against or challenge, someone else has probably come up against it. And seeing the way people solve problems is so great. And it's very easy to get very focused on your farm and the daily work and the challenges, and getting outside of that and getting different perspectives is so helpful. And every farm is unique, and so the way some other person solves a problem or meets a challenge might not work on your farm because their resources might be different, but they might also do something you're like, oh man, I never thought of that, or that's really helpful. And also talking to people and hearing about their failures can be really reassuring and stuff like that. So, unfortunately with the pandemic, like, this was supposed to be in person, and then you would have gotten to see our fields, and I would have been able to show you where I've like screwed up and what we've done about it and the improvements we've made. So I think that that's like by far the best thing you can do. As I said, I think the grazing chart is a great learning tool because it forces you to think critically. You know, there's a lot of stuff on the internet, certainly, which can be helpful. There's a lot of good articles. I subscribe to Graze, which sometimes there's really interesting, helpful things, sometimes not. It's a publication, but it's at least something to, read over lunch and make you think a little bit, which I think is really good. But I think like the biggest thing is, talking to other farmers, having other farmers come to your farm, going to their farms, and seeing and learning from other people's experience has been by far the best thing that I've done. And everyone's different. Some people like that, some people don't. I love talking about this stuff, so it's fun when people are interested, and it's fun to kind of collaborate and hear other people's ideas. And so, trying to build up, trying to find a community around that. And, I found that the sort of farming resources on the internet have lagged behind many of the other areas that I've sort of been involved in, but there's more and more out there. And I think that can be a good tool, especially right now when it's some of the in-person stuff is is limited.
Yeah.
I know NOFA has a whole bunch of resources too that I've checked out, and so yeah, it doesn't take much searching around to find a lot of articles. And one thing I'll add, with the risk of being a little long-winded here, is I also think it's really important to take things you read and things that people say with a grain of salt. And people can get very dogmatic and be like, I figured this out and this is the right way to do it. And that's, I think, very risky. And the other thing I've learned is like there's not really a right way to do any of this, and anyone who's like, this is it, I figured it out, I don't trust those people, because dairy farming and grazing is extremely humbling, and like every single day screw something up, learn something new. And so like learning from people's mistakes, and it's easy to sort of feel like other people know more, and you read all these like articles by experts who say you have to do it this way or this way. And it's really important to remember that there's a million different ways to do it. And again, each farm is unique and is going to have its own strengths and weaknesses. And try to learn what you can from other people and from articles, but also not feel that like anyone has like the silver bullet that's going to make everything work, because they definitely don't. So yeah, that's my little lecture on.
Cool. We have a little bit more time. I thought it would be a good moment for anybody who wants to ask any other questions or talk about their farm, have things that they want to share, and anything like that.
This is Mary Ellen. Topher, how you been affected with the cheese with COVID? Because specialty cheeses were hit pretty hard this spring.
Yeah, it's been very challenging, and it's definitely been a bit of a roller coaster. When things hit in March, our wholesale just cratered. Obviously with specialty cheeses, a lot of restaurants, and so that just disappeared literally overnight. And that's created a lot of problems. And that's where, I referenced sort of adding aging space.
Yeah.
That's because we've like literally run out of space to store our aged cheeses, because we're not able to move it fast enough. We've had to dump some milk, not very much, because we ran out of aging space. We were stacking cheese anywhere we could. So we're trying to deal with that, but that's been sort of slow. The positive thing initially is that our farm store also, like every week for like the first 6 to 8 weeks after that hit in March, was like a new record, and we basically became a small grocery store. We drastically increased the variety of products we sold, we can't keep meat in stock. It seems like people were dealing with it by buying huge quantities of meat and ice cream. So we're selling a lot of ice cream that we don't make, and meat and other products. And so from sort of like a cash flow standpoint, that's been pretty helpful. That's really come down a lot, is even before things started technically reopening, I think people just started getting tired of the pandemic thing and started going back to Stop and Shop and stuff like that. And so it's wholesale starting to come back a little, but honestly, things are more challenging now than they were in the spring, even though also all our farmers markets were shut down then. But the farm store was really carrying it. So we still are in, I would say, a precarious position. And it's very hard. You think of farming with the unpredictability of the weather and animals and all of that, but like right now, like not being able to rely on our experience with selling our product to predict the future is definitely really hard. And what's going to happen next week, next month, next year, it's like so completely up in the air. So yeah, it's been hard, and it's been a roller coaster. But David just weighed in, and he said he was at the farm store and bought our breakfast sausage. And so it's people like him that are definitely like keeping us going. And that's like super appreciated.
One other question was, how many days do you make cheese?
Usually pretty much 4 days a week, every week of the year. There's been some times when we've been dropped to 3 days, but we found it is better generally just to do 4 makes and have some of those be smaller when we're at low milk volumes. Occasionally in the spring, the last few years, we have had to add a 5th make on Saturday because the volume of milk we have gets to the point where we can't go from Friday to Monday without, overflowing the bulk tank and or then having too much milk to be able to make cheese on Monday. This year with the pandemic and having to dump some milk and also having higher raw milk sales and also just the way we calved, we were able to avoid the Saturday make, which honestly was good because we didn't have the staff this year to handle the 5th make day. But it's a lot of cheese making, and so even with the seasonality, we do have that sort of relentless quality of dairy farming of, milking the cows twice a day, every day of the year, making cheese 4 days a week, every week of the year. And there's some really amazing parts of that, and then also some pretty big challenges of that for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Topher. Thank you so much for all the great info and insight. And thank you for joining us tonight. And if you found this event useful and inspiring, please consider becoming a member or making a donation to help us continue our important work. And thanks as well to our grant funders, Mass Dairy Farmers, the Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation, Green Pastures Fund, and thanks again to our sponsor, Organic Valley. And we do have some more online educational opportunities you may be interested in. The NOFA Summer Conference is going online this year, and that is held July 20th through August 9th. As well, the NOFA Organic Land Care Program is offering their accreditation course. It's going online, again, for the first time. It will be held this August, and spaces are limited, so you'll want to encourage people to sign up if they are interested, and people can find out more about that at organiclandcare.net. So that's all I have. Thank you so much again for being a part of the NOFA Mass community, and I look forward to seeing you next time.